My name is Dr. Alexei Volkov. I was never meant to tell you this. That fact alone should tell you something about what happened at Yuri-5. For 37 years, I carried the weight of that mountain in silence. Not by choice, by necessity. The kind of necessity that arrives with men in unmarked coats who make clear that your career, your family's security, and your ability to leave Russia all hinge on forgetting what you witnessed. In the Soviet Union, this was not a threat. It was simply how information was managed. I am telling you now because I am 74 years old, because the files have begun to leak through channels I never anticipated, and because 3 mountaineers died trying to reach that station after we left it. I cannot undo what I saw, but I can ensure it is not buried with me. Let me establish the baseline. Between 1977 and 1995, the Soviet Ministry of Defense constructed 5 high-altitude research stations along the spine of the Caucasus Mountains. Officially, these were meteorological and atmospheric study posts. Unofficially, and this is important, they were part of a classified program called Operacja Жизнь, or Operation Life. The purpose of Operation Life was not disclosed in any of the documentation I accessed, even after the Cold War ended. Not because the files remained classified, but because the program's true objective had been deliberately abstracted from the records themselves. I was brought in as a biophysicist in 1989. My specialty was human adaptation to extreme altitude and low temperature environments. I had published papers on cellular respiration at hypoxic levels. I had designed monitoring systems for cosmonauts. This made me useful. I did not know until I arrived at the briefing site near Tbilisi that 3 researchers had already gone missing from the Yuri station network. 1 from Yuri-2, 2 from Yuri-3, all within the previous 18 months, all at altitudes above 4,200 meters, all during what Soviet command termed sensor calibration cycles. The briefing took place in a nondescript office building in what was then still the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. The man leading it was Colonel Dmitry Sokolov, Chief of Alpine Operations for the ministry. He was in his early 60s, possessed the kind of posture that suggested decades of military service, and wore an expression that indicated he was delivering instructions to someone he had already written off. You will spend 6 weeks at our highest station, Yuri-5. You will conduct a comprehensive physiological and neurological survey of the 3 remaining personnel stationed there. You will collect blood samples, tissue samples, and conduct a full cognitive assessment. You will generate a report. You will not ask questions about previous personnel. You will not attempt to access archive documentation from Yuri-2 or Yuri-3. Is this understood? I was shown a single photograph. It showed a facility that looked like something from the early 1960s, corrugated steel walls, a communications antenna that seemed too large for the structure, and a surrounding perimeter of what appeared to be monitoring equipment. The latitude and longitude coordinates placed it at 5,633 meters above sea level, in a region of the Caucasus that was difficult enough to reach that even the Soviet military had only established the station through a combination of helicopter drops and equipment relays during the brief summer season. The soldiers assigned to accompany me were hand-selected. Major Sergei Kozlov, a veteran of Alpine Corps operations with 15 years of mountain service, Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov, a medic trained in emergency field medicine, and Corporal Yuri Karpov, a communications specialist whose call sign was Relay, because he had never lost a signal transmission in 7 years of deployment. We departed Tbilisi on July 3, 1989. The weather that summer had been unusually volatile. Early monsoons, unseasonable cold in the mid-elevations. The mountain itself seemed reluctant to let anyone ascend it. It took us 8 days to reach the lower staging area at Yuri-5. That station sat at 4,850 meters and served as a relay and supply depot for the summit installation. It was staffed by a permanent garrison of 6 men, all of whom seemed surprised to see us, despite the fact that our arrival had been communicated weeks in advance. Commander Yuri Tolstoy, who managed Yuri-5, was a man of maybe 40, who clearly spent most of his adult life at altitude. His face was weathered beyond his years. His hands trembled slightly when he was not actively engaged in some physical task. I asked him how the men in his command were doing. He paused for a full 10 seconds before answering that they were functional. That word, functional, not healthy, not good, functional. "How long have you been here?" I asked him. 26 months. "How long has Yuri-5 been staffed?" Another pause, longer this time. Unclear. "Command sends replacements. I do not ask why the previous personnel required replacement. That is not my function." That night, at 4,850 meters, I experienced what I would later understand to be the first genuine indicator that something was wrong with the Yuri station network. Not something wrong with the mountain, something wrong with what had been done to the mountain. At approximately 2200 hours, I awoke to the sound of Corporal Karpov establishing radio contact with Yuri-5. This was routine. We were scheduled to initiate a communications check every 4 hours through the night. But something about his inflection told me the attempt was not proceeding normally. "Yuri-5, this is relay at 4. Do you copy?" Static. Then a sound I had not anticipated. A sound that seemed to exist between the static and silence. A kind of rhythmic whisper that resolved into something that might have been breathing if breathing were a mechanical process. Karpov repeated the call. The sound intensified. Then it stopped. "Did you hear that?" I asked him. "Heard noise," he said, in the particular grammatical style that Soviet soldiers used when they wanted to avoid committing to a description. "The mountain temperature is wrong. It might be the amplifier." It was 42 degrees Celsius when we checked the equipment. The amplifier was fine. Major Kozlov made a note of the incident in the log. He did not comment on it verbally. Soldiers of his era learned that anomalies existed in 2 categories: problems that could be reported and things you documented in case someone later asked you to prove you had noticed. The next morning, we prepared to make the final ascent to Yuri-5. The route was steep, technically demanding, and took 8 hours under good conditions. The weather had deteriorated overnight. Visibility was limited to perhaps 30 meters. Temperature was hovering around -8 degrees Celsius. The wind came from the northwest in gusts that occasionally forced us to stop and wait for the worst of it to pass. When we reached the outer perimeter of the facility, it was approximately 16:30 hours. The sun was already declining behind the upper reaches of the mountain. In summer, this far north and this high in altitude, there would be a few hours of twilight, but the clouds were thick. The light was strange, that particular quality of illumination you get when the sun is behind a substantial overcast and the snow is reflecting whatever it reaches it, creating a kind of sourceless, even luminescence that makes it impossible to judge distance or perspective. The facility itself was larger than I had anticipated. The photograph had not conveyed scale. The main structure was perhaps 40 meters in length,
constructed of riveted steel panels that had been painted a dull gray but were now streaked with rust and discoloration from whatever chemical processes had been occurring on the mountain for 12 years. There were 3 outlying structures, one that I would later learn was a laboratory, one that housed power generation equipment, and one that served as a storage facility. But what struck me first was the silence. Not the absence of sound, though that was complete, but rather the quality of silence that you encounter when you are at an altitude where the air itself is too thin to propagate normal acoustic phenomena. Every breath was audible. Every footstep was distinct. The wind, when it came, sounded like it was coming from beneath the earth rather than across it. Major Kozlov formed a perimeter. Lieutenant Petrov performed a quick visual survey of the facility exterior.
Established his communication station just inside the outer door of the main structure. The door itself was not locked. The door swung inward with the kind of resistance that suggested it had not been opened recently, but not so much that it indicated years of disuse. The hinges were clean. The locking mechanism was engaged, but not rusted solid. Someone had maintained this door. Someone, or something, had ensured it remained functional. The interior was not what I expected. I had anticipated either pristine Soviet military efficiency or the decay of an abandoned facility. What I found was something between, a space that had been meticulously organized at some point and then gradually allowed to enter a state of controlled disorder, as if the standards of maintenance had been deliberately relaxed but not entirely abandoned. The main corridor ran roughly 50 meters through the heart of the structure. Emergency lighting, old Soviet-era neon strips powered by backup systems, illuminated the space with a sickly greenish-white quality that seemed to drain color from everything it touched. The walls were lined with equipment, atmospheric monitors, temperature sensors, humidity gauges, and instrumentation I could not immediately identify. All of it appeared functional. All of it was covered with a fine layer of frost that suggested the interior temperature was being maintained at or near freezing. "The living quarters are to the left," said a voice from deeper in the facility. I had not seen him approach. Major Kozlov had his hand on his sidearm before I had fully registered that we were no longer alone. The man was thin in a way that suggested not recent deprivation, but rather long-term adaptation to an environment that did not support normal human metabolism. He was wearing a Soviet officer's uniform that appeared to be from the early 1970s, though the rank insignia had been removed. He was perhaps 50 years old, with hair that was uniformly white and eyes that possessed a clarity that seemed incongruous with his physical condition. "Captain Leonid Smirnov," he said, offering no salute. "I am the senior personnel at this station. Command informed me to expect a medical evaluation team. You, I assume, are that team." His Russian was perfect, but carried an accent I could not immediately place. Not Ukrainian, not Georgian, something else, something that suggested he had spent considerable time in a region far from Moscow. "Dr. Alexei Volkov," I said, maintaining my bearing despite the fact that something about this man's presence was creating a physiological response in me that I could not rationalize. My heart rate was elevated. My hands were slightly trembling. "Major Kozlov, Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov, and Corporal Yuri-5. We will need to conduct a full medical assessment of all personnel. I understand there are 3 of you stationed here." "2," said Smirnov. "There are 2 of us now." "Your records indicate—" "My records," he interrupted, "indicate what Moscow believes is true.
What is actually true is a different matter. Come, I will show you the quarters. You will need to understand the situation before you speak with the other personnel." Major Kozlov moved to object. I raised a hand, authorizing movement. This was a calculation. Smirnov was offering information, and in situations like this, situations that existed in the gaps between official documentation and reality, information was more valuable than protocol. Smirnov led us through a series of corridors that gradually descended below the main level. The temperature dropped as we went deeper. The emergency lighting became less reliable, creating patches of shadow interspersed with zones of that sickly green fluorescence. The frost on the walls grew thicker. "The previous resident," said Smirnov, "was Sergeant Major Andrei Volkov, no relation to you, I assume. He was stationed here for 18 months. His medical evaluations were standard. His psychological assessments indicated some minor depressive symptoms, which is common at this altitude. His case was marked as normal attrition, transferred to a lower station for recovery. That was the official designation." We reached a door marked with Cyrillic lettering I did not immediately recognize. Smirnov produced a key, an actual physical key, not a modern electronic mechanism, and unlocked it. The room beyond was approximately 10 meters square. It contained a cot, a small desk, a locker, and a window that looked out onto the mountain face. The window was covered with a thick layer of frost from the outside, but someone had deliberately scraped it clear from the inside, creating a small viewing aperture. What struck me immediately was that the room appeared to be in the process of being inhabited. There was a journal on the desk, open to a page that was filled with handwritten text. There were clothing items hanging on a wall-mounted rack. There was a photograph pinned to the wall above the cot. And there was something else, a smell. Not unpleasant, but distinctive. Something like copper mixed with something botanical I could not identify. "When was this room last occupied?" I asked. "Continuously," said Smirnov. Major Kozlov stepped forward. "By whom, if the sergeant major was transferred?" "He was not transferred," said Smirnov, turning to face us directly for the first time. His eyes were different now. The clarity I had noticed had shifted into something that might have been anticipation. "He is here. He has never left the station. He remains at the station, and there is very little I can do to prevent him from continuing to remain at the station, despite command's repeated assertions that I should ensure all personnel are either functional or removed." Lieutenant Petrov's hand moved toward his sidearm. Smirnov made no threatening movement, but something in his posture suggested that weapons would be ineffective in whatever situation we were encountering. "Take us to him," I said. Smirnov nodded, as if I had passed some kind of test. "Yes, I thought you would say that. The others usually demanded extraction, or reinforcements, or clarification from Moscow. But a scientist understands that observation must precede interpretation. Come." He led us further down the corridor, past the living quarters, deeper into the structure. The air was changing, becoming denser somehow, despite the altitude, as if the atmosphere itself was being modified by something. The frost on the walls was no longer a thin crystalline layer, but rather thick ice that had begun to form architectural structures, columns and arches that seemed too geometric to be natural. We reached a sealed door marked with biohazard symbols and the designation Laboratoria Zona 7. Laboratory Zone 7, I translated, though I had not seen this designation in any of my briefing materials. "Captain Smirnov, I need to understand what is happening here. My credentials authorize medical assessment only. If there is a biological hazard..." There is no biological in the conventional sense. What exists here is a physiological state that does not correspond to any condition documented in Soviet medical literature, which is why, I suspect, Moscow could not decide whether to classify the situation as a medical emergency or a scientific opportunity. He keyed open the door. The chamber beyond was approximately 30 meters in length and was entirely lined with monitoring equipment. Computer systems, Soviet-era machines that looked like they belonged in a facility from the 1960s, were arranged along one wall, their screens displaying data streams I could not immediately parse. There were medical devices I recognized: EEG machines, cardiac monitors, metabolic analyzers, and there were devices I did not recognize, machines with no labels, no obvious input or output, their purposes unknown. At the center of the chamber was a figure. He was suspended, although not by any mechanical means that I could initially perceive. He was positioned upright, his arms at his sides, his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow as to be nearly imperceptible. He was wearing the remnants of a Soviet military uniform, though most of the clothing had deteriorated to fragments. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and appeared to be covered with a fine crystalline structure that might have been frost or might have been something that had emerged from his own physiology. His name was Andrei Volkov. He had been in this position for approximately 14 months. His metabolic rate, he gestured to the monitoring equipment, is approximately 3% of normal human baseline. His cardiac output.
The breathing continued for approximately 40 seconds. Each inhalation and exhalation was identical in duration and depth, a rhythm that no human metabolism could sustain with such precision. It was a sound I would hear again years later in my nightmares. Not frightening in the way that sudden violence is frightening in the way that observing a violation of natural law is frightening, the kind of fear that registers in the primitive brain before the rational mind can construct explanations. Then the eyes closed again, the breathing stopped, the figure returned to its previous state, suspended, motionless, existing in a condition that defied categorization. "How long has he been doing that?" I asked. "The breathing?" said Smirnov. "Since day 8 of the transition. Initially, I thought it was a malfunction in the life support equipment, but I removed all external respiratory support 6 months ago. The breathing persisted. The pattern is consistent. The timing is consistent. The only variable is the duration of the cycles. They have been gradually lengthening. When the transition first occurred, the cycles lasted 30 seconds each. Now they last between 35 and 45 seconds. If the progression continues, by approximately year 3 of the transition, the cycles will last approximately 55 to 60 seconds, at which point the respiratory rate will match that of deep hibernation in certain Arctic mammals." I approached the figure cautiously, not because I believed it posed a physical threat, though that assessment was purely speculative, but because I needed empirical data, close observation, measurable data, something my rational mind could process even if it could not explain. His skin temperature, measured with a contact thermometer, was 4.2 degrees Celsius. His radial pulse was present but barely perceptible. His pupils were indeed metallic in appearance, though when I examined them with an ophthalmoscope, the structures behind them were entirely normal. Retina, optic nerve, all systems intact. It was as if something had replaced his iris and pupil with an external layer while leaving the rest of the eye untouched. "How did he get this way?" I asked Smirnov. "Walk me through the timeline." Smirnov gestured toward a workstation. On the desk were detailed logs, handwritten entries, official medical records, and what appeared to be personal journal entries in Volkov's handwriting. The progression was meticulously documented. Initial arrival at Yuri-5, July 12, 1988.
Psychological assessment, normal. Physical assessment, normal. Behavioral notes, standard. July through September 1988, routine operations. Volkov reported normal adaptation to altitude. Morale assessments, stable. Work performance, satisfactory. October 1988, first anomalous entry. Volkov reported unusual dreams involving the mountain. The dreams were described as recurring, but not distressing. He reported awareness of presences in the lower sections of the facility. Investigation revealed no unauthorized personnel. Assessment, altitude-induced hallucinations, consistent with well-documented psychological effects of extreme altitude exposure. November 1988, dreams intensified. Volkov reported increasing awareness of communication from the lower chambers. He began deliberately spending time in Laboratory Zone 7, despite this being outside his assigned duties. Captain Smirnov noted the behavior, but did not restrict access, pending psychological evaluation by Moscow. Moscow's response: monitor but do not interrupt. Document all reports for later analysis. January 12, 1989, the transition occurred. According to Smirnov's account, Volkov had been in Laboratory Zone 7 for approximately 4 hours. Smirnov was monitoring from the adjacent equipment room when he observed Volkov's vital signs beginning to change: heart rate dropping, respiratory rate decreasing, body temperature declining. Over the course of approximately 6 hours, Volkov's biological parameters shifted from normal human ranges into the state I was currently observing. But the most significant entry came from Volkov's own handwriting, dated January 11, 1989, the night before the transition. "I understand now," he had written, in Russian that was precise and unnervingly calm. "The mountain is not trying to harm me, it is trying to preserve me. The dreams are not communication from an external entity, they are communication from something that exists in the structure of this place, something that has existed here for considerably longer than any human installation, something that has learned to exist within the frequencies we are broadcasting. The equipment we have installed here, the atmospheric monitors, the frequency resonators, have created a bridge, not between Moscow and the mountain, but between the mountain itself and human consciousness. And I am the first successful integration. I am not becoming something else. I am becoming part of something larger. I am not afraid anymore. I am finally understanding what it means to be at rest." I read this entry 3 times. Each time I felt the same sense of vertigo, the sensation that I was observing something that should not be observed, documentation that should not exist. "Has he communicated since?" I asked. "Not verbally," said Smirnov, "but there have been other indications. The monitoring equipment shows synchronized fluctuations in his neural activity and the electromagnetic field surrounding the facility. When those fluctuations occur, his eyes open, he observes, he breathes, then he returns to the baseline state. I have attempted to establish correlation between these events and external stimuli, but the pattern appears to be entirely internal, synchronized with something in the mountain itself, not with any measurable external phenomenon." Major Kozlov had not holstered his weapon. His eyes were moving constantly, assessing the space, the equipment, the figure, searching for threats that conventional military training could not have prepared him to identify. "We need to extract him. Medical evacuation, now." "To what end?" asked Smirnov. "He is no longer what would be recognized as a medical emergency. His biological parameters are stable. His condition appears to be improving, not deteriorating, and any attempt to move him from this location will almost certainly result in what Moscow would classify as biological collapse." "But you cannot know that," I said. "No," Smirnov agreed, "but I cannot test it, which is precisely why Moscow sent you. They need an assessment from someone with your credentials, someone who can make the determination of whether this represents a medical failure, a scientific breakthrough, or something that falls outside both categories. Corporal Karpov's voice came through the communication headset. His position was still in the upper sections of the facility, maintaining the radio equipment. "Dr. Volkov, I am receiving a transmission from command. They are requesting a status report. What should I transmit?" I looked at Major Kozlov. He looked at Smirnov. Smirnov looked at the figure suspended in the center of the chamber, Andrei Volkov, or what remained of him, or what he had become. "Tell them," I said slowly, "that we have located Sergeant Major Volkov. Tell them that he is alive, though in a state that requires extensive documentation before any recommendation can be made regarding recovery or continuation of the mission. Tell them we will require additional time for comprehensive assessment." "And if they order extraction?" asked Karpov. I did not answer immediately. I was still looking at the suspended figure. At that moment, without any apparent external stimulus, his eyes opened again. The metallic surfaces turned directly toward me, and in those reflective surfaces I saw not my own face, but something else, a landscape I didn't recognize, mountains, but not the Caucasus, snow, but from a latitude much further north, and beneath the snow, structures, vast structures, geometric and precise. The eyes closed again. The breathing sound came again, measured and deliberate, and I understood, in a way that I have spent the subsequent decades trying to articulate and failing, that Sergeant Major Andrei Volkov was not a victim of something that happened at Yuri-5. He was evidence of something that had always been at Yuri-5. "Tell command," I said to Corporal Karpov, "that we have encountered a biological anomaly that requires in situ documentation. Request authorization to remain at the station for an extended evaluation period. Tell them that premature extraction would risk invalidating all data collection. Tell them we will transmit comprehensive findings within 7 days." The response came back within minutes. Authorization granted, extended stay confirmed, daily status reports required. It was the last communication we would successfully establish with Moscow for the next 36 hours.
The sound persisted for approximately 3 minutes. It moved through the facility in a pattern that suggested deliberate navigation rather than random movement. Major Kozlov had drawn his weapon and positioned himself in the corridor. Lieutenant Petrov was attempting to locate the source using a handheld motion detector. Corporal Karpov was maintaining position at the communications station, ready to transmit an emergency evacuation request if the situation deteriorated beyond tactical assessment. Smirnov remained calm, disturbingly calm. "That is Petrov," he said. "Ivan Petrov. He typically moves through the facility between 1900 and 2100 hours. The pattern has been consistent for the past 4 months. I have attempted to intercept him on several occasions, but he moves through sections of the facility that are structurally impossible to navigate using conventional means." "Structurally impossible?" I repeated. "The facility is constructed of steel and concrete. There is no mechanism by which a human or a formerly human entity could navigate through solid structural materials." "No, there is not, which suggests that whatever Ivan Petrov has become is no longer constrained by the spatial limitations that govern human movement. Come, I will show you the section where his presence is strongest." I gestured to Major Kozlov to maintain perimeter security. He positioned Lieutenant Petrov and Corporal Karpov at strategic points throughout the upper sections of the facility. Then I followed Smirnov deeper into the installation. The lower levels of Yuri-5 became progressively deteriorated. The frost on the walls was thicker here, creating ice formations that had begun to obscure the underlying structure.
The emergency lighting failed in sections, leaving us dependent on handheld torches. The temperature dropped further. My readings indicated we had descended below -15 Celsius. Smirnov moved with absolute certainty through this maze of corridors and sealed passages. He knew every turn, every junction, every section where the steel had corroded enough to be dangerous. We passed through areas that had clearly been sealed off deliberately, doorways that had been welded shut, corridors that had been blocked with debris. But Smirnov had learned to navigate around these obstacles, or the obstacles had been deliberately circumvented to allow passage. "When did you discover that sections of the facility were inaccessible?" I asked him. 3 weeks after Volkov's transition, he said. I was conducting routine maintenance checks. A sealed corridor that I had passed through dozens of times had become impenetrable, not physically blocked, but somehow impassable. The air pressure changed when I approached it. The temperature fluctuated. The structure itself seemed to resist entry. I attempted multiple approaches. Each attempt resulted in what I can only describe as disorientation, a mental state of confusion and spatial disorientation. That describes a psychological phenomenon, a mental state of confusion and spatial disorientation. Yes, that is what I concluded, until I began finding evidence of Petrov's movement through sections of the facility that were supposedly sealed off entirely. We reached a section of the facility that appeared to be a science laboratory. Equipment lined the walls, apparatus for spectroscopy, chromatography, thermal analysis. But the equipment was covered with something that was not frost. It was a kind of crystalline accumulation that looked almost organic in its formation. It had grown across the surfaces of the machines, into the crevices between components, and in some cases had formed structures that bridged between separate pieces of equipment, as if the crystalline material was attempting to create new connections or pathways within the devices themselves. "What is this?" I asked, taking a sample with a collection container. "Growth," Smirnov said. It began approximately 1 week after Petrov's transition commenced. I initially believed it was a mineral accumulation, ice crystals perhaps, or salt deposits from the mountain's geological composition, but it is not inorganic. Microscopic examination reveals cellular structure, filaments, branches. It appears to be a form of crystalline organism that propagates through the facility when conditions are appropriate. I examined the growth more carefully. The structure was indeed cellular. Under the magnification of the handheld microscope Smirnov provided, I could see what appeared to be individual cells, each one crystalline in structure, but arranged in patterns that suggested organization and purpose. The formation was vaguely reminiscent of fungal mycelium, a network of filaments designed to distribute through a substrate and extract nutrients from it. But these filaments were made of something that appeared to be silicon-based, not carbon-based. They were incorporating the metal and minerals of the laboratory equipment into their structure, creating hybrid formations where organic and inorganic components merged. "The crystalline growth is accelerating," Smirnov said. "When Petrov transitioned, it appeared at a rate of approximately 2 centimeters per week. Now it is advancing at nearly 8 centimeters per week. If the progression continues at current rates, it will consume the facility within 18 months. "This is impossible," I said, though even as I spoke, I was collecting samples, taking measurements, documenting everything with the precision of a researcher confronting data that contradicted his foundational understanding of reality. The sound came again. The scraping, shifting noise that might have been Petrov. But this time, it was much closer. It came from inside the laboratory itself, from a section of the wall where the crystalline growth was particularly dense. The wall was moving, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The metal panels that formed the interior wall were flexing outward as if something behind them was exerting pressure. The crystalline growth on the surface intensified, filaments moving with visible motion as if responding to whatever was pushing against the wall from the opposite side. I stepped back. The movement accelerated. Then it stopped. And then, in a section where the crystalline growth had already created a gap in the metal paneling, something emerged. It was not Petrov, or at least not what Petrov had been. It was a hybrid form, part human skeleton, part crystalline structure, part something that defied categorization. The entity moved with jerking, irregular motions. It was not walking, it was not crawling. It was somehow navigating using a combination of movements that seemed to originate from multiple points within its structure. And it was making a sound, not breathing, but a kind of static, white noise with occasional pitched components that varied in frequency and intensity. "Ivan Petrov," I said. It was not a question. "What remains of him, or what he has become, there is considerable ambiguity regarding which interpretation is accurate." The entity stopped. The static sound changed. It became lower in frequency, more rhythmic, almost musical in its complexity, and I understood with absolute certainty that it was attempting to communicate, not with language, not with conventional symbolic systems, but through modulation of the electromagnetic field that pervaded the facility. I could feel it as a kind of pressure in my sinuses, a vibration in my teeth, a resonance that seemed to originate outside my body, but to propagate directly into my central nervous system. Major Kozlov's voice came through the headset. "Dr. Volkov, we are detecting significant electromagnetic fluctuations throughout the facility. Corporal Karpov reports that all radio equipment has gone offline. Recommend immediate evacuation." I did not respond immediately. I was still observing the entity, studying it, attempting to reconcile what I was witnessing with any framework of biological understanding I possessed. The entity moved again, this time toward the wall opposite to where it had emerged. As it moved, more of the crystalline growth spread across the laboratory surface, advancing in real time, covering equipment, filling spaces, connecting disparate sections of the facility into an integrated network. Smirnov touched my arm. His grip was firm. "We need to leave this section. When Petrov becomes this active, the structural integrity of the facility becomes unreliable. Sections have collapsed, sections have sealed themselves. The mountain is integrating his presence into its own structure." We leave through the corridors we had traversed, but I noticed that the route was different on the return. Passages had been blocked, new corridors had appeared. The facility was changing in real time, reorganizing itself around the presence of the crystalline entity.